In Winnipeg, we spend $304 million a year on our police. That $304 million is over 26% of our yearly spending, and the police are the highest funded service in our city. Of the money you pay into property taxes, whether that be through your rent or through the taxes you pay on your house, 31% of your property taxes are being used to pay for Winnipeg's policing system. What is the system we are funding? We have been told time and time again that the police are there to protect us, that they are there to get the bad guy. Who are the police actually getting? And by getting, I mean removing from their homes to be incarcerated, or being physically assaulted by the police in the streets, to straight up being killed on the spot during scary and dangerous altercations with armed, aggressive, and threatening police officers who can and will kill you if they deem fit. The root of our policing system in Canada comes from the Northwest Mounted Police, nowadays known as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP. Before we talk of the Northwest Mounted Police, we need to talk about two things that happened before their formation. In 1867, the British North America Act was created. This is the original Canadian Constitution, and it gave federal governments authority of Indians and the lands reserved for Indians. 4 years later, in 1871, the federal government started negotiating the numbered treaties with Indigenous peoples who were east of the Rocky Mountains. These treaties were negotiated in bad faith and under coercive conditions, such as starvation created by the federal government. The numbered treaties laid out what land the federal government would be taking and what lands would be reserved for Indians, or reserves for short. The numbered treaties would be finalized in 1921. 2 years after the start of the negotiations for the numbered treaties, in 1873, the Northwest Mounted Police were formed. Their role included keeping Indigenous peoples on reserves, and they enforced this using vagrancy laws that existed at the time. Indigenous peoples who were not on reserves were arrested and forcibly returned to their reserves, or incarcerated. 3 years after the formation of the Northwest Mounted Police, the Indian Act of 1876 was passed. In it were the laws that enforced residential schools. At this time, Mounties will begin forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families, sometimes killing fathers who would defend their families, other times incarcerating whole families for the purpose of removing a child. These children were taken far from their homes to prevent family contact. They were taken to boarding schools where the abuses they faced were abhorrent and inexcusable. Between the formation of the Mounties and contemporary policing, there have been countless instances of police and Mounties taking part in vile acts of genocide. We do not need to look far to see countless examples of this, from the Indian pass and permit system to the 60s Scoop and Starlight tours. The fact that policing in Canada originates from a genocidal act of white supremacy is not up for debate. It is a fact that we must acknowledge. When we come to terms with that, it does not take much to see that the system of white supremacy that policing is rooted in is continued systemically today. Let's address policing in Manitoba, my home. First, let me describe what Manitoba looks like. Manitoba is the homeland of the Métis Nation, a nation of people born of resistance to so-called Canada, and a people that fought tooth and nail just to exist and practice their culture today. It is the home of the Anishinaabe people. It is in their language that we name our province, Manitoba, the place where the Creator sits. The name of our city, Winnipeg, comes from Cree peoples, translating to muddy water after our lake, Winnipeg. Indigenous peoples in Manitoba represent 15% of the population, but Indigenous men represent 75% of incarcerated males, and Indigenous women represent over 80% of incarcerated females. On top of these horrific statistics, Manitoba has an incarceration rate of 2 times higher than the national average. In Manitoba, the police aren't just imprisoning Indigenous people at an alarmingly high rate, they are killing them as well. In Manitoba, Indigenous people represent 2/3 of people killed by the police. Last year alone, in 2019, police killed at least 7 people. Our brutal and violent policing system overwhelmingly targets Indigenous peoples and is a continuation of a white supremacist system from which its root is firmly planted. If we are anti-racist, or if we simply care about our fellow community members, It is fundamental to acknowledge the harm done by our police. Once we have done that, it is imperative that we demand for them to be defunded and replaced with changes for our social well-being. That $300 million should be dedicated to causes that remove the need for criminal acts. People should be fed, housed, and taken care of as members of our community.